checking it's sharing okay. Okay, yep. We're all good to go. So, hi everybody. Just want to welcome you to Dr. Gary Werskey. So, Gary is a Harvard-trained biographer and cultural historian who has held academic positions in Edinburgh University, Imperial College, and the University of New South Wales. He is currently an honorary associate in the University of Sydney's Department of History. He is an engaging, experienced speaker and the co-founder of the Blackheath History Forum. In his novel that we're going to be talking about today is Picturing a Nation. Hopefully you can see that all okay. So, Picturing a Nation is a pioneering, richly illustrated biography of of Fullwood and his extraordinary career as an illustrator, painter, and war artist back to life while casting a new light on the most fabled era in the history of Australian art. Fullwood's illustrations for the popular picturesque Atlas of Australasia and the Bulletin held shaped how settler colonial Australia was seen both here and around the world. So thanks also to New South Wales Publishing. If people ask a question during the Facebook Live, they'll have a chance to win a copy of Picturing the Nation. So please ask any questions you have for Gary. So thanks so much for joining us. I just read this a couple of nights ago and really enjoyed it. And probably I would say not something I normally would read. But yeah, I did find it interesting and really loved the pictures in there as well. So would you like to maybe share a little bit about the novel and how you came about writing it?
Well, I have to say, in truth, Jackie, first of all, thanks for having me on, and hello to whoever else is out there at the moment. Um, just to start off with, you saying this is not a book that maybe you might normally not have picked up. The same I would have to say is true of our son. And I have to say that probably the best review I've had so far uh, of Mike, who's a great mountain biker and a follower of footy, is that he really enjoyed the book.
Yeah.
It quite surprised him because it was readable, and it's actually quite a good yarn in the sense that Fullwood led a very adventurous life. And maybe this may seem typical now. It wasn't typical then. He lived his life all over the world. He was a child of the empire, and he grew up in Birmingham. At the age of 20, when his dad tragically died of alcoholism, he and his mother and two sisters came to Australia to try their luck here. And Fullwood essentially struck it rich here as an artist. He had a wonderful time here. But would you believe that with the collapse of the art market in Sydney, 17 years later, he was back on a boat trying now to find a way of supporting his young family. And so he ended up in New York, had a very exciting year in New York. Unfortunately, his wife was pretty cranky about being there. And so they ended up in London, where he spent the next 20 years of his life, including during the First World War, only to return to Sydney in the 1920s, where he died in 1930. So it was a very adventurous, very global story, and one touched with a lot of tragedy, but also with a lot of interest. So that's the starting point. And I guess I should also, full confession, this is also a bit of family history, because my wife is in fact Fullwood's great
Oh,
niece.
wow. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah,
So that's the
and
connection.
and of course I don't know how many people are interested in their own family's history, but of course we all live in hope that somewhere in the family there's an undiscovered genius. Well, we didn't really necessarily believe that was the case with Fullwood, but I had a crack at writing a picture book for our grandchildren about 12 years ago. And although they weren't that interested, I got quite a bit more interested after that, and realized that Fullwood was probably the most viewed artist of his time. because he did black and white art for the Illustrated Press, as well as paintings and etchings and all the other things you'd normally expect an artist to do. And he was also really great friends with the artists that nowadays, from that period, some people at least now know of, people like Tom Roberts and Arthur Streeton, for example. But he was his own man, and in fact, he was so loved by his mates that they nicknamed him Uncle Remus.
Oh.
That's not a name that would maybe mean that much now to people, but Uncle Remus was the name of an old black storyteller from the American South. And it was a character invented by another American writer, Joel Chandler Harris. You may have seen one of these stories dramatized by Walt Disney called Brer Rabbit and the Briar Patch. Anyway, Fullwood was named Uncle Remus because he was such a good storyteller, either in a cafe, knocking back cafe noirs, or around a campsite, if you like. So he's a really interesting character.
And I found his drawings and paintings and that were all very varied, weren't they? There was a big, they're not a large range of different mediums, and he
would try his hand at most anything. I mean, he was a really, really good draftsman, and I'll just try to get this up close enough. This is an example of pictures that he drew when he was 22 years old for the picturesque atlas, which is pretty remarkable stuff. Here's a picture of a big wheat field in Victoria, which he went down to when he was 23. And while down there, he drew this great street scene in Ballarat, in Victoria. But as you say, it was really varied what he actually tried his hand at. So consequently, he was also a great painter. This is a bird's eye view of Sydney in 1888. Absolutely huge affair. And I think if he'd been a better marketer, I sometimes feel like I should have gone back in time and helped him a bit with his salesmanship, because his stuff was really, really beautiful. And then this is a picture called Sad News, a big oil painting, which is now at the National Gallery of Australia. And I particularly love this one. This is a nighttime scene in Sydney. And it's actually his wife, young wife, Clyda, walking down by the old post office on a rain-splashed evening with the lights coming off the pavement. So he was doing all of that even before he went to London in 1900. And then in London, he again turned his hand to an even different style of painting. And let me see if I can bring out one of these for you. Well, here on the same page, you've got an etching, you've got a monotype, and what I'm really looking for at this point is this big oil painting of London on the Thames, which he actually took to the Venice Biennale in 1909, 1910, and so on. And then, just for good measure, as if he didn't have any other avenues to explore, he also did postcards of Australia while he was there. And then during the war, he ended up going to France. And he actually was on the Somme in the final closing stages of the war. And he did these beautiful landscapes, but he also did some cracking battlefield pictures. This is one of the Battle of Villers-Bretonneux. And after he'd seen an awful lot of misery and hardship, because he was also a medical orderly during the First World War, so he saw, the wounded Anzacs coming back from Gallipoli and the Somme and so forth. I mean, he really saw the lot. So when the war ended and he came back to Australia, He
Mm,
was really
mm,
ready to have a change of
mm,
heart and a change of scene. And
mm,
he really loved his time in Sydney in the 1920s, the last 10 years of his life. And a real credit to the guy, because I have to say he was quite a drinker
mm,
for a very long period of time. And he fell in when he came back, not with his old mates, not with the old guard. He actually teamed up with a bunch of young cartoonists who had also been soldiers during the war. And these were very rowdy, hard drinking, hard living, fun loving bohemian cartoonists. And they adopted him as a kind
mm,
of,
mm.
elder spirit, if you like, but a really genuine, fun loving kind of character. So that gives you an idea of the variety of his work
Yeah.
and the character of the guy.
Mm, mm. And
Yeah.
like you said, he certainly travelled a lot for that time as well. I really enjoyed seeing some places that I'd visited myself, and like that the Ballarat one that you showed with the clock tower, which I
Yes.
think, yeah,
He,
that's
well, in fact, and let me see if I can sort out a couple more of these as well. Um, he also traveled to Cape Town.
no,
Uh, and an example of this is in the
mm,
slave market, the old slave market in Cape Town. But the one I love, and this gives it, because there's a lot of black and white illustrations in the uh, in the book. For example, this is a great fire in
mm,
Sydney that was
mm,
produced at that time. But what I'm looking for, speaking of places that some people may have been to, look at this one. This is Grand Central Station
mm,
in New
mm,
York. So Fullwood would go in from Connecticut, where he was living, every day, and he would walk into this palace of a train station,
mm,
and he captured all the drama going on with people getting on and off the trains at Grand Central. He really,
mm,
really did love New York as well. Um, but I should say there was a dark side as well to the fellow. Um, and I should say maybe more dark side in terms of things that happened to him, but probably the saddest collection of things happened with his own young family. And when they got to London, he had two boys uh, under the age of 5, and his wife was really suffering from having
mm,
been separated from her family and from Australia. At any rate, she basically had what they called a manic episode, um, and she was committed to a very famous lunatic asylum that you may have heard of, Bedlam,
mm,
there. And what's worse is that she had just fallen pregnant
mm,
again, and there was a feeling at the time that women might be undergoing great trauma in connection with pregnancy. At any rate, she had hallucinations, she was down, she was up. It was very, very distressing for her and for Fullwood. And even more distressing is that for a few years, Fullwood had to pay for all of the bills connected with her care.
yeah,
And let
mm,
me tell you, it was tough for him just to be in London to
mm,
earn enough money to do that. And finally, he had to declare himself a pauper
mm,
so that she could be committed to a London County lunatic asylum as well. So all this was going on in his life, and yet, and then he had his oldest boy eventually died of meningitis, and
mm,
in some ways he couldn't, in personal terms, turn a trick. But the remarkable thing about him is he kept going.
yeah,
He was,
mm,
as he said to somebody, he might be showing everywhere and selling nowhere. Um, but he was a bully optimist,
mm,
and that spirit is just something that really struck people at
mm,
the time, that he could endure so much tragedy and yet go on growing as an artist and producing
mm, mm,
this lovely stuff.
mm. And you mentioned that Forward was a relative of your wife. Was he someone who had been talked about a lot in the family?
Oh, another family story.
Yeah.
So the first painting I ever saw was hanging on my wife Hillary's wall when I first started courting her in 1985. And this was a painting that Fullwood himself had given to her mother, one of his nieces. And her mother was a great champion of Fullwood, but she couldn't get her sisters to share this enthusiasm. So all Hillary's mother's life, she was trying to find people who could get interested, in Fullwood, without much success, apart from Hillary. So yeah, there was that kind of family thing that not everybody takes to the family history with the same degree of enthusiasm. And the other thing is that, we all get in a rut in terms of how we tell stories about our families, about our histories, our national histories, and about our art. And the way people ended up telling the story of the art of Fullwood's era, he became less and less mentioned. And everybody started focusing on just 2 or 3 guys like Roberts and Streeton and so on. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is bring out this guy's art. And there are 74 color plates in the book and 50 black and white illustrations. So there's enough evidence in the art there to say, wait a minute, we ought to be taking a closer look at this guy. And there's also, for anybody who can make it down to Canberra before July 11th, COVID willing, there's an exhibition on the National Library that I co-curated called The Nation Imagined, the Artists of the Picturesque Atlas, and Fullwood is one of the 3 featured artists. And it's a really special exhibition. And there's no substitute for seeing this art in the flesh. Any rate, if you can't get down to Canberra, on YouTube, there's a curatorial tour that I do. I take people through the exhibition on YouTube.
Oh, okay, nice.
For about 40 minutes.
So how can we find that?
I think all you have to do is go to YouTube and search on NLA, A Nation Imagined.
Okay.
And the YouTube will come up.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, that sounds good. And we've got a few people who've been watching, and some questions have people been asking. So good. Also, some people are saying that the artwork you've been showing looks amazing. Mary Lou also said with what you said, it sounded like he had quite a traumatic life, and she said art can be very therapeutic. So yeah.
Absolutely. No, look, absolutely. He had people always talked about him as having this kind of poetic sensibility, and he really enjoyed getting out in the bush, especially, or on the harbor. And he found a tremendous amount of solace of painting. And you'll see in the book, a number of pictures are taken are done either at sunset or sunrise. Periods of quietness, but also of promise and solace and all of that. So a good observation, because I think that's probably the thing in the end, ultimately, that kept him going. He kept finding beauty, even in his darkest moments.
And Geraldine's wondering if you had always been interested in art.
Very good question. I'm not an art historian by training. So perhaps maybe like everybody else listening to this, this is not a project you would knowingly go into, but, and this is going to sound a bit trivial, but, from a young age, I was really interested in comic books and cartoons and black and white art. And I grew up near Chicago. And when I was a teenager, for the first time, I went into the Art Institute in Chicago, and I went, wow, look at all these amazing Impressionist and post-Impressionist paintings. So I've been somebody who, it's an old phrase, somebody who's always been looking. And Fullwood's, though, has really, over the last 10 years, made me look a lot harder. Not just at art, but just everything around the surroundings. And I realize, how much goes by us, if we don't just kind of cultivate the art of looking and enjoying what we see.
Yeah.
So I've come very late to the party, but better late than never.
And I'm interested, how hard or easy was it to research his life?
Very hard indeed,
Yeah.
because there are no personal papers, there are not even
Mm,
family photographs. So apart from his art, I really relied upon a resource, and I recommend this to anybody else who's interested in the past. I went to the Trove site, the National Library, which is this incredible resource of digitized newspaper articles. And you just punch in the name of somebody you're interested in. So I
mm.
punched in his name, and my goodness, there were so many references
Oh, well.
in the newspapers, at the time, uh, from the time he came to Australia until his death in 1930, an overwhelming number. So that was incredibly helpful.
Mm.
Um, but in the end, it was hunting down as many of his pictures as I could and looking at them and placing them against where he was in his life.
Mm.
That was the big resource.
Mm. Mm. And when you were researching, is there something that you found that really surprised you?
Ah, my gosh, yes. I mean, just for a start, the fact that people talked about him so
Mm.
much, I
Yeah.
couldn't believe it. Because here's a guy nobody talks about now, but back in his day, uh, he was somebody who commanded a tremendous amount of attention.
Mm.
And as I say, among his artist friends, he was not only a great storyteller, a great company, but he was a
Mm.
great champion
Mm.
of young artists, of professional artists, and that came through, in these newspaper articles. Um, so yeah, I just think it was just so surprising that it turned out that at the time he was just so highly regarded and loved, which is not something a lot of artists necessarily
Mm.
get back from
Mm.
their mates.
Mm. And I'm interested to know as well, are you a big reader normally yourself, and maybe what sort of things you like reading?
Yeah, one of the occupational hazards of writing a book is that you read a bit
Mm.
less while you're actually
Yeah.
trying to get it all together. And of course, I'm now out on the road speaking wherever anybody will have me.
Mm.
Um, so a lot of the reading that I've done in recent years has been stuff related to the book or the period. Um, so recently, there are two books. Uh, One by Mark McKenna, a historian, called Return to Uluru, which
Mm.
is just an amazing memoir uh, of Mark's search for two Aboriginal men that were killed at Uluru by a Northern Territory policeman. And I
Mm.
won't give anything away, but it's the most amazing
Oh,
saga.
okay. Mm.
There's another book by Grace Karskens called People of the River, which is about the whole history of the people on the Arubin, the Hawkesbury
Oh,
River,
okay.
from before contact and afterwards. And it's a very richly developed book. But the other kind of stuff I've been reading, and this all comes out of politics from the United States, especially the Black Lives Matter movement,
Mm.
is that I've begun to read an awful lot of the history of Black people in the US, which I'm sorry to say I really wasn't across. And so
Mm.
I've begun to read some really magnificent books by a fellow named Ta-Nehisi Coates, who's talked about recent struggles in Black America, but also a wonderful biography of Frederick Douglass, who was a great spokesman for Black people, by a fellow named David Blight. But I do get fiction
Mm.
as well, very
Mm.
much so. And there's one piece of historical fiction by Peter Cochrane called Martin Sparrows in the Title. And it too is set on the Hawkesbury.
Oh, okay. Mm.
And that one's good. And also Kate Grenville's recent book about Elizabeth MacArthur, The House of Leaves, I think it's called. Anyway,
Mm.
that's been excellent too.
Yeah, yeah, thanks for those recommendations.
Yeah.
I'm interested to know, how long have you lived in Australia for?
Well, you can tell it hasn't done my accent any good
No, yes.
at all. I met Hillary in 1985 when I was on study leave when I've
Mm.
been living in London, because I lived in London for 20 years
Oh, okay, before,
prior to
yeah.
coming here. But I came here in '87,
Okay.
and I'm now an Australian citizen, and
Mm.
I love being here, and I particularly love being in the Blue Mountains, which is
Mm.
where we live.
Yeah, it's a lovely place, isn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Mm. Might
yeah.
be a bit cold there at the moment as well.
Oh yeah, it's not too bad. Not too bad. Yeah.
And how long did it actually take you to like research and write Picturing a Nation?
Um, Too long, according to my wife. I've dedicated the book to Hillary, who inspired and endured the journey.
Mm.
And so, really, you can date it roughly from about 2009,
Mm.
and you can date the work on getting an exhibition up from about 2013. So this is really long-term stuff,
Mm.
and it's partly because when you're a relatively little-known author writing about somebody that nobody's ever heard of,
Yeah.
there's not a big market,
Mm.
as it were. And I have to say, had Fullwood been a woman, I think I could have got this book published very, very quickly,
Oh, really? Yeah.
because there's a huge hunger, of course, to
Mm.
discover women artists who've been neglected by history. But there's not a
Mm.
great hunger to look at these white fellas
Mm.
who in fact have also been overlooked, as well. But any rate, a lot of persistence
Mm.
has, finally paid off. And New South has produced the most beautiful book. It
Mm.
really is just as an object, and just for the pictures. It's just, I think it's really a book to treasure.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with that. And can you tell us, are you working on anything else at the moment?
um, I'm, I'm, you, I, as long as Hillary doesn't listen to this broadcast, I'm open-minded as to what's going to happen next. What I would
Mm.
love to do is actually encourage other writers, other historians, to start to unpacking some of the many stories that I only touch on in the book, because um, there are other artists who deserve their own biographies for sure.
Mm.
And Also, the art of the illustrated press, the black and white art, is some of the most gorgeous art
Mm.
ever produced in Australia. And in fact, we were, at the time, one of the world's leading centers of black and white art. But
Oh, okay.
nobody, I mean,
Yeah.
but nobody
Mm.
has seen this since it came out over 100 years ago. So, yeah, if I had nothing else to do, then I might, have a crack at some of that stuff. But really, this is more a thing about wanting conversations to start happening, for people to start
Mm.
talking about this
Mm.
history, to start talking about the art, because believe me, this art still influences how we see Australia
Yeah.
to
Mm.
this day.
Mm.
And yeah, so it's worth revisiting this stuff. And apart from getting more conversations going, I'd really love to engage other writers and scholars to say, come on,
Yeah.
join the party.
Yeah. And what would your biggest advice be to someone who was thinking about doing that?
Oh, I think to take your courage in your hands,
Yeah.
really, about this. Uh, don't be daunted by the fact that you might not at the outset know everything that you might need
Mm.
to know
Mm.
to get your story out there. But I think it's really, as long as you're aware about why this means something to you, then chances are, by and large, it'll mean something to somebody else
Yeah. Mm.
as well. And
Mm.
you'd be surprised once you start talking to other people. They'll say, "Oh, that's interesting. Tell me more."
Mm. Mm. And Mary, who's watching, said it's a real credit to you to put so much time and passion into your research.
Yeah, this is a tough time. I mean, I've not been in academic life for a couple of decades, really.
Mm.
Um, but this is the kind of scholarship which, is necessary if we really want to dig into the past, and
Mm.
particularly to the lesser known stories.
Mm.
It takes a lot of time and perseverance and effort. And at the moment, in universities, people are really under the pump. they're really having to produce stuff, every year, every 2 to 3 years. And while some of that is really excellent stuff, some of this these longer term stories, the stuff that's harder to hunt out, that's what we're missing. And so, yeah, I'm not sure why I've kept on as much as I have at this point. Probably I need to be psychoanalyzed or something. But in the end, I guess it's the last thing I'd say to anybody wanting to have a crack. The other thing is to believe, once you get into the writing of it, that you really discover a joy in the writing. Just the buzz of trying to create a paragraph, link it to another paragraph, and before you know it, you've really got a story that other people really want to hear.
Yeah.
And that's fantastic inspiration too.
Well, thanks so much for joining us and talking about Picturing a Nation. Just reminding everyone about the book. Hope you can check it out, everyone. It's really a really great read, and good to see like some of Australia's history and all that in it as well, and some really beautiful pictures in it. So thanks everyone also who's joined in and asked some questions. And thanks to New South Publishing for arranging this for us today as well. So thanks everyone, and bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Jackie. Thank you. Bye-bye.